Glember, The Tale of a Monster. Written, recorded, and illustrated by A.K. Brookman. Chapter 17. The True Leap. Day 40 continued. The wind threw her weight against us as we neared the mouth of the cave. The narrow ledge that graced the opening of the cave offered little before the steep drop into the cloudy depths below. So great was the distance, I could not make out the earth below, whether shrub or tree, rock or sand awaited. Hugging the side of the cliff face, we made our way quickly as I threw the contraption pack over my shoulder. The added weight, I hoped, would not allow the wind to toss us to our deaths when we made the jump. The risen denizen of the wizards must not have caught sight of our dash, perhaps struggling for its feet in the slick and cramped tunnel passage, for it never gave chase. We managed to walk along the narrow ledge until it lifted us near the top of the rocky rise that was the rim beside the path. We did not slow. Rather, we picked up speed and hope with each step, first racing for the path and then northward along it toward the bridge. "So this is the sacred pass?" I asked Glember. He continued sprinting, and I found myself exerting all my strength just to keep pace. I wasn't sure if he was going to answer the question. "The distance from the beginning of the ravine," Glember said, and took a breath, "and on for several days further," he continued after another gasp of air, "is collectively called the sacred pass by your people. I thought I heard a noise from behind, but was afraid to look. Others," Glember explained, "simply call it home." The path began to rise, and the winds began to push more forcefully against us. Glember began to slow his pace, and he reached out and grabbed my arm, encouraging me to do the same. Now, I chanced a look back and could see the two wizards emerging from behind the rim of the cliff face. They were only now leaving the cave, and yet I'd seen the speed of their fiery spears. They could attack from a great distance. Glember followed my eyes and frowned. A great gust of wind nearly took me from my feet. "Focus, human," Glember said. "It will get worse." Just ahead, I could see the end of the path, where the rocky ledge ended. By now, we were making our way across the rock-hewn bridge. The chasm below dropped seemingly forever. I could see what was likely a tiny river running along the chasm at the bottom, yet it was so far below I couldn't decide if it was this or foliage. It seemed we stood at the top of the world. I could see mountains stretching across the land in all directions that only yielded to the mist of distance. We continued across the high bridge, slowing now to little more than a brisk stride, and now I could see the other half of the bridge. It was a great distance below, and angled such that one could slide off it into the depths. I knew we would have to crawl once we struck the bridge, if we struck the bridge. The jump itself, although a terrifying drop and leap into the vast nothingness, was at least possible, if somewhat insane. With the wizards thrown into the mix, it seemed not a far leap from suicide. My legs locked up, and I came to an abrupt stop. I couldn't do it. I opened my mouth to say something, but could utter no sound. The rush of energy that filled me to the point that I felt it spilling forth from my fingers and toes had subsided, and with its recession, fear gripped me. It felt as though the world was shaking back and forth. I began to feel dizzy. No one could make that jump. Glember, who had not initially convinced me this was a logical idea, now found the strength that had been sapped from me by the vast emptiness below and the howling winds and peaks we now towered over. He did not wait to explain. He reached for my head as our clothing flapped wildly in the chilling winds, and turned my head back toward the advancing wizards. I slammed my fist against Glember's chest. "Damn you," I said, and he staggered back a step. He looked back toward the wizards, and then toward the lower passage. We were crouched now to reduce the force of the wind. The bridge had no sides. It was only an uneven rocky arm reaching out into nothingness. Far below, to the right of the bridge, its second half reached out similarly. "We must aim as though we are leaping over the other half," Glember said. "It will be against every instinct in your body, but we must do it if we are to have hope of making it across." He reached out his arm. "Everyone who aims for the bridge," he said, "dies." I didn't know if I could do it. I didn't think I could just leap out into the nothingness, hoping the wind would push me over to the bridge. "We will count our steps loudly, taking each together, and jump at the same time," Glember said. A fireball whizzed past my head and continued on its way into the cloudy haze. I looked back and saw the wizards. They were chanting as they advanced. I gripped the arm of the last gargoyle as the winds of the dry peaked mountains tore through my clothing. I gazed down into the immeasurably vast depths below. We stood above the clouds, preparing to tempt fate as perhaps no gargoyle man had in the history of Meristheria. "Are you ready?" Glember asked me. Another fireball sailed past us, crackling with heat so intense I could feel its warmth against me. "No," I answered Glember. "Yet, between death and death, at least this one, I may choose," I said. Glember nodded, and then turned toward the end of the bridge ahead. Then he looked back toward me and cautioned, "Don't trip." We took the first step. "One," Glember said. "Two," Glember shouted. A portion of our words were carried off by the winds, yet I could hear well enough and joined Glember as he shouted. "Three." My heart was pounding with each footfall, and the winds pounded against us the same. It seemed as though I was going to faint, but I did not. I imagine it would have been easier if I did. "Four." A man without conviction has no purpose. Where had I heard that? It was as if the earth was opening up to swallow us, yet not unlike the heavens were opening up for us. I think, indeed I am certain, I had never felt stronger than I did at that moment. The faint feeling shattered, as though it had never been. A focused mind can banish the whole world, I've heard. I know in that moment it banished indecision. 5. We counted as the bridge began to stretch toward us from below. I looked into the vast empty air beyond the other side of the angled bridge. I knew where to aim my leap, and yet it didn't feel right. Glember was right. There was nothing so terrifying in the history of my days compared to this. I stopped counting. I kept my footfalls in accord with Glember's, but I could no longer speak. The end of the bridge neared, was closer now, and was at its end. We leaped out into the air, where a man may fall forever, aiming past the mark. That uncomfortable feeling of weightlessness gripped me. I began to kick as I clawed at Glember with my opposite arm, trying to get a better hold. It seemed, and rightfully so, that if I let go of him I would die. No wind came. The lower bridge moved below our feet until we had passed it by. We were going to plummet to our deaths. Fear seized me, and I began to scream out into the echoic air, where my cries would be swallowed by the endless plenitude of the mountain peaks and the spaces between. And then the wind suddenly slammed its brute force against us. We twirled in air, and I felt my feet moving out from under me. I kicked, trying to correct them. I was descending parallel to the ground. Slowly, the bridge below began to slow its movement away until it came to a stop, and then it began to move back under our feet. The wind was going to save us by correcting our movement. Suddenly, I was seized as if by giant claws. Glember was ripped from my grip and plummeted as I was yanked back upward with enough force, it seemed, to tear my limbs from me. I flailed about in confusion before I realized I'd been snatched out of the air by a massive creature. I could feel its talons now gripping around my body so tightly I had difficulty getting a breath in. The earth began to spin. The mountains began to drop out from under me, and then they came back up at me. Suddenly, I was falling but only a short distance before I struck the ground. I rolled over, breathing heavily, just in time to see the massive bird burst into magical shards that dissolved in air. I had been dropped before the two remaining wizards. I turned over to my side and stole a glimpse below. Glember lay on the opposite side of the bridge, motionless. He made it, yet was he alive? One of his legs was bent awkwardly to one side, and I knew at once it was broken. One of his wrists looked as though it endured the same. His palm was displayed in a position that should not have been allowed. Oddly, the wizard's staff I'd been carrying lay under him, although I could feel the iron spike pushing against my side yet tucked into my cloak. Suddenly, Glember's body began to slide. At first, I thought he was moving, and dared to have hope, yet he was not moving at all. Rather, the wind was moving him. His body stopped, and then it moved ever so slightly again. He was slowly sliding off the end of the bridge. I was turned over then, and forced to endure the angry eyes of the remaining two wizards of Nye. I was prepared to speak when suddenly it felt as though a creature was crawling over my lips. I reached up to wipe them to no avail. One of the wizards was chanting, and I could suddenly feel my lips contorting with pain. It was over after a moment, and as I felt, I realized what had happened. "There will be no further chanting from you, wizard," one of the men said. The spell caused my lips to grow together. There was neither space left for air nor words. "Get up," one of the men said, kicking me. As I did, the second seized hold of me. "Interesting," the wizard said, looking at my pack. "Is this one of ours?" he asked his companion. "Certainly is," the other wizard answered. As I was searched for weapons, they discovered the Zyron spike and laughed, placing it back into place and shackling me as Glember had in previous days. "Let's take him back to the cave for now," one of the wizards said. "Question him there." The other nodded, and we made our way back. I had no sooner edged my way along the narrow ledge and entered the cave when one of the wizards kicked me from behind, and I stumbled forward, falling hard without stretching my arms, as I had learned to do to prevent the mechanism from activating and piercing my spine. I heard a noise deeper in the cave, the rough inhalation of some creature. "So you're familiar with these," one of the wizards said, kicking my side. Suddenly, I heard something sprinting forward toward us. I looked up just in time to see the raised denizen staggering our way. "Wait, stop," one of the wizards said as the golem lunged for him. The two stumbled backward toward the mouth of the cave. The second wizard, who'd been taking his time for fear of the heartless winds, was just rounding the corner as his last remaining companion and the golem came wrestling toward him. They fell at the mouth of the cave, and as the wizard reached out for his companion's leg to save him, it was too late for the both of them. He disappeared over the ledge, and yet his grip was sure. His companion, in a last wide-eyed stare, slipped over the ledge where the three fell for who knows how long before they spattered to nothingness below. A moment a prisoner, another free. When I returned, I saw Glember still lying motionless on the opposite edge of the bridge. I watched him for some time, yelling out to him, hoping he would move, that the obvious breaks to his bones were not real. Every now and again, the wind would howl out in rage, and Glember would slide a little more toward the edge. Soon, the wind would carry him off, and he would be gone from my life, gone forever from the world. I felt sick. It wasn't right. How the monster had been harsh with me was now forgivable. His race hunted to the last. I could not imagine what he had endured. Had he a lover? Children? How many had been taken from him? How many had he buried? How long had he walked alone with none left to speak to, none left to touch, no voice left to hear, only memories? What had he been made to endure? And I knew now why he stared off in thought so many times, why the places we'd been had haunted him, why he spoke so little and yearned for what would never return to him, all in complete loneliness. The wizards of Nye had taken everything from him. I understood now. I knew now what drove him mad. The wind rushed against the edge of the bridge. I had to duck to endure its chilling bite. Glember's body shifted a little more. He was close to the edge now. I thought perhaps I should stay, that someone should witness the end, that there was greater sadness in him slipping away unknown and unseen, as though the world cared not at all. And yet I didn't want to see it happen. I didn't want to watch him fall away, nor did I want to turn and wait, only to turn back and see the edge of the bridge where he had once been. We cannot always place reason in our actions. At times, there is only emotion, and the event. The space between is filled with a cry, or a scream, or a whirl, or heartbeats. At times, it is just emptiness, or joy. It was not joy this time. I screamed and threw my arms out. It was a reaction without thought. The shackles of my wrist pulled at the chains of the contraption. I heard the metallic click. I knew the siren spike would activate. I knew it was the end, and yet I could not undo the action. I could not turn back what had been. Nothing happened. I reached my arms out. I stretched forward my legs. Nothing happened. I watched the wind shift Glember's body again. I remembered his words. "Perhaps your spine is stronger than the Zyron, human." I told you, I remember now the night Gargle found me. I remember what happened when I was captured by the wizards of Nye. Perhaps your spine is stronger than the Zyron, human. And yet, nothing happened. The mechanism did not send the Zyron spike into my back. You can end it any time, human. I could have ended it any time. I understood now. I stood in the cold mountain gale where the clouds roll by below. I was certain I was no longer the same person who left his farm 40 days ago. I began to walk away from the bridge. The chains, though intact, could no longer keep me, nor would the wind take sides. It was not for the wind to decide the fate of men. It was for man to decide his own fate. Perhaps the winds were strong enough that they could carry the words of men. I had hope for this, and I whispered, "The rain, Lily, the rain." I ran as fast as my legs would move. I would aim even further, I thought, and I leaped off the end of the bridge. A friend once said, looking upon the skewed and unfair plenitude of our luxuries, I've often thought, there must be a reckoning. Eventually, we must pay for the crimes of our people, or our children will pay if we stand idle. Would Lily pay for the crimes of men? For the fall of the gargle? Do we daily thwart the innocence of the youth with the weakness of our spines? Chapter 18. Glember's Song. Fate and luck are quite distinct. That day I chose one and acquired the next. I dragged Glember from the edge of the bridge. His eyes were staring out into the sky. "Just let me fall, human," Glember whispered weakly. "Just let me fall." I managed to drag him as far as the trees before my strength was gone. It was not as difficult as you may imagine. The trek was downhill mostly. I splinted his leg using the staff, his wrist using the Xiron spike. I made a small fire, and as it sent its embers skyward, and as Glember lay in silence, in obvious pain, I asked, "Does this put us one day ahead of schedule?" I smiled and turned to Glember, the last gargle. I thought it would gain a smile from him, but it didn't. "I don't think we're going to make it, human," he said. In the campfire light, I could see that the dark of one of his eyes yet remained much larger than the other, as it had throughout the evening. I sat there until he fell asleep, and I wondered if it would be the last night for the last gargle. Days 41 through 44. When Glember awoke the following day, I was dragging him down the mountainside on a few branches tied together using the pack and chains I'd managed to slip out of, no longer under the watchful eyes of the others. We made steady pace, traveling down the slick path, and I found that Glember's pack was full of dried fruits and nuts. No trapper or hunter myself, it was this alone that kept us alive, for Glember no longer made use of his keen vision and skill to catch game. Glember occasionally stretched out one of his limbs, but otherwise remained still. He spoke little, even when provoked, and at times I was convinced he was slowly dying. By the end of the fourth day, the land had begun to level out. We'd reached the bottom of the great mountain, and rather than guiding Glember down on the land raft, I would be forced to pull him. "This is as far as we go, human," Glember said. "You cannot pull me any further with any real progress, and the dangerous terrain ahead would but invite wild animals to us," he argued. "Any wild animal would spit you back out, Glember," I argued. "Human," he began. "In the morning, Glember," I said. "We can argue about it on the morrow." Glember said nothing else, and the 44th day was swindled away by time. Days 45 and 46. The following 2 days were challenging indeed. By the end of the 46th day, I'd reached an impasse. The rocky land came once again to a narrowing ahead, and the earth began to rise once more. I'd made terribly little progress. I dare say the day gained was lost by now, if not more than a day. Glember had slipped in and out of lucidity. The duration of his waking hours was being slowly whittled away by time, and soon I knew he would no longer wake at all. He was having trouble chewing food in his weak state. Either it was that, or his appetite was diminishing. I could not say. As night settled in, I imagined the giant boulders and crags ahead were shifting in their stony stretch. I was growing ever more weary myself. The food was nearly gone. I knew I had to make a decision soon. What was I trying to prove? What was pushing me on? In the morning, I decided, I would try to answer these questions in the morning. I was too tired, and the journey was beginning to steal away my focus as my mind. I'd found a place nestled amid the great boulders where the wind was not so cruel, and there we made our camp, if it could be called so. Oddly, it seemed as though it had grown warmer as we approached the ravine, and I decided not to spend the last of my strength on building a fire. I was cold, but not so much so that I could not sleep. In this way, the odd rumbling ahead and the feeling of shifting hills could not rend from us our needed rest, and the night consumed us. This concludes part 13 of 17 of Glember, The Tale of a Monster. You're listening to the first book of the Meristherian Trilogy. Please subscribe if you like the content, where you'll have access to additional books. Feel free to support this channel by telling others about it. The books are free to listen to, as you know, and everyone's welcome here. Leave a friendly comment if you like. Again, this is AK. Thanks for listening, friends, and see you next time.